Well, any decent teacher at the beginning of a series or a course has to make sure the students are in the right classroom. That joke kind of doesn't work here because there's only one classroom, but I'll do the joke. Yeah, well, my dad used to say underwater basket weaving. So here's a couple classes. If you're looking for the class Street Fighting Mathematics, you're in the wrong classroom. Or if you're looking for Star Trek and religion, this isn't the right. And by the way, those are actual college courses at MIT and University of Indiana. So you can actually go seek those courses out if you're interested. And actually, Street Fighting Mathematics, I looked it up. There's a textbook by that name, and the PDF is free online. So you can actually go read the book if you want. I downloaded it. I'm going to take a look tonight.
It probably teaches tactics for tackling mathematics, but it's a catchy title.
Yeah, that's right. The synopsis is something like not trying to be so exact so you can have more success. It's sort of like estimating and working on the fly like you would in a street fight. So, but sorry, this is the night of technological problems. We're here to talk about having a strategic faith. And by that we mean being able to defend the faith in our everyday interactions, but graciously. And hopefully, wherever we're planted, interacting with people and moving them towards a relationship with God. Let's see here. So I'm excited that we can learn a game plan that's going to help us navigate those interactions. And part of the idea of having the game plan is it can feel tricky to interact with people. So we want, an added incentive of having a game plan is to diffuse some of the stress and the fear that we have about those interactions. Okay. So I'll just hold this up so you know where I'm at. I'm going to start with this where it says the task. So we can sort of zoom out for a moment here and think about the church in general and our mission in general. As followers of Christ, as the body of Christ, we have a common task, right? A mission. And that's to proclaim the gospel, share the good news, and to make disciples as people respond to that good news. So here's a couple of, in the Gospel of Mark and in Luke writing in Acts. Mark records Jesus saying, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." And Luke writes Jesus' instructions. "You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." So I want to point out a couple things. One is that in both of these passages, this charge that Jesus gives, it's the last charge he gives to his disciples. Right? This is the last interaction he has before the ascension. So consider for a moment, some of us are just getting to know each other, but say we knew each other well and one of you was going to disappear indefinitely, and it was your chance to give us your last charge, right? You'd try to make it for all it's worth. It would be something important. And we'd all listen extra attentively because of that. So I just wanted to give you that picture of the gravity of what Jesus is saying, and that he's choosing his last charge carefully because that's the task he's leaving us with. And if you read the book of Acts, Jesus is still working behind the scenes through the Holy Spirit to enable us to accomplish that task, right? And another point, another observation, is that it's very geographic what he's saying, right? There's this universal scope he gives of to the ends of the earth, all the way from where they're starting out in Jerusalem to the ends of the earth, which is kind of daunting, right? Like, all I need you guys to do is just spread the word over the entire known world. No problem, right? Now, depending on your perspective, in Irvine, we're in Irvine, right? So depending on your perspective, you could consider yourself Jerusalem, because that's close to home. Or you could be the ends of the earth. If you're judging from first century Palestine, we're the ends of the earth, right? 2,000 some years later. So what's the point? The point is that wherever you are part of the equation. You're part of the commission. You're part of the spreading of the gospel and making disciples. And as we get into this, I think if we're attentive and observant, we'll see the Holy Spirit actively presenting us with opportunities, what I call divine appointments, to be part of this. You know, what it sounds like this really big thing, and it is, the Great Commission, but really where the rubber meets the road is in our everyday lives. And our part of that, most fundamentally, is the interactions we have. There are a lot of ways that the church as a whole, engages this, sending missionaries, going on trips together, doing functions together, but every day in multiple situations, we have an opportunity to partake in this. So let me give you an example of what I would call a divine appointment that I've had. Last year, I flew to Michigan, Traverse City, Michigan, which, by the way, just very briefly, to give you an idea of what Traverse City is like, during an evangelism outreach, we were just going around trying to go out on the street and drum up some conversations and talk about God, right? So I see a New Age bookstore. I think, oh, well, that should be interesting. So I go into the New Age bookstore and I just started asking questions. And I won't tell the whole interaction, but the interesting thing to me about our day and age, which we'll talk about the landscape of our society in a moment, but the landscape of society in that neighborhood was that I asked her about Reiki healing. Have you ever heard of Reiki healing? It's like this New Age sort of energy, spirit guide helping you heal or something. I don't know everything about it, but that's what I had heard something about it, and I said, oh, that's a good conversation starter. So I started asking her about it and learning about it from her. And I come to find out that the nuns in Traverse City partake in learning Reiki healing. So that's just to give you an example of where we are these days. Yes. No, it's not an indictment against Catholicism in general. It's just an indictment against that particular situation. Anyways, that's just a sidelight. The story is that, like a glutton for punishment that I am, I got the cheapest flight I could, which was 3 different flights, 3 different planes, 3 different airports. So having done a little bit of practice of evangelism outreach, it kind of fired me up, right? I wanted to have some interactions with people. And hey, I have 3 plane rides. Maybe I can, witness to 3 different people. First 2 plane rides, nothing. As much as I prayed and sought out conversations, it just was not happening. It was flat. So by the 3rd plane ride, I thought, well, I'm not going to push it. I'm just going to do my homework. I was working on reliability of scripture presentation, typing on my iPad. And so I get on the plane. The guy sitting next to me has a thick accent. And I'm thinking, oh, that just adds to the fact that I'm not going to talk to him because of the language barrier. And I don't know if you guys use iOS or Apple products, but some of the apps, like the word processing app, when you open up the template, it's all in Latin, right? Like, say this is where your text is going to go. They have a bunch of Latin filled in, and then you type over it. You overwrite it. So that's what I was working on. I have this presentation, and the parts I haven't written in yet are in Latin. So the gentleman next to me has just woken up from a nap after we're well into the plane ride, and suddenly I hear, do you know Latin? I thought, I didn't even know he spoke English. And I said, What? No, I don't. I'd explain that's just what's there. So it turns out this gentleman is an Italian immigrant that's been on a work visa in the U.S. for like 10 years. And he tells me, he asks me what I'm working on. I tell him I'm working on the Bible, reliability. And he says, well, that's interesting because I've personally been on a journey to compare Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and because there's a lot of conflict between them, and I'm trying to figure out what's what. And I thought, wow, just when I gave up, this divine appointment dropped in my lap, right? So to make a long story short, we had a very long conversation. He asked a lot of questions. I made a lot of points. Tried to move him towards an impasse where he had to either believe in Jesus as something more than just a good teacher or avoid him altogether. And we concluded our conversation. I left him with some things to think about. And I had this sudden realization that the plane was quiet. And this wasn't a huge plane, it was one of those 4 or 5 seaters. And I realized that I had just been working on the right thing at the right time, talking to the right person who was already thinking about the right things. And I had just presented this defense of the resurrection and the reliability of Scripture to an entire, whoever was within earshot that wasn't even having a conversation. And the lady in front of us turns, between the seats around to us and says, that's the most interesting conversation I've ever heard. So you never know when there's going to be an opportunity, and when you say yes, and you use your preparation and go forward, it's amazing what can happen. So what I want to do is I want to challenge you. I'm not sure how much interaction you've had, but I want to challenge you from wherever you're coming from to take that risk. I call it the tipping point, right? Where, I don't know if you've had this experience, I've had it over and over again, where there seems to be something brewing, like, I think I should talk to that person, and it's the right opportunity, and then sometimes you do, and sometimes you just sort of back away from it. Like, you're at that tipping point, and you're either going to go for it, or you're going to rationalize why you're not going to. So one mission of this course is for you to have one moment, in your everyday life where you take advantage of that opportunity, that divine appointment where you can go forward at that tipping point. Now, if you look at this, we talked about the task, the Great Commission, and then letter B, your challenge, this is what I just challenged you, is basically this. 1, be on the lookout for a divine appointment, and 2, go for it. That simple. And, we know that it's fundamental to what Christianity is. That's what we're to be about, is proclaiming the gospel. So I added this little quote here. Don't ask if it is going to be easy. Ask if it's going to be worth it. So that's a little extra motivation. And I've included this other picture because the method we're talking about is very conversational and relational. This isn't, a street corner preaching. This is getting to know people and asking questions of people that you're already going to interact with anyways, and moving them, like I said, moving them towards a relationship with God over time. So this picture is a picture of how simple it can be, just a normal, interesting conversation. So what I'd like to do for a few minutes, and there are 4 of you, so you can do 2 groups of 2. I want you to share with each other basically your juiciest, story of somebody you interacted with. And this could be something that went really well or something that went really bad. I want your best and your worst story. So actually, maybe since there's only a few of us, maybe we can just do it together. If there was a bunch of people, I'd have you break up into groups. So does anybody want to go for a really good story, or a best story, or a worst story?
Well, I can think of one because of the
Really?
And it was the strangest. I mean, I was just thinking, you know, I had a lot of experiences, but what stuck out, that's what came to mind. I haven't thought of this in years.
Wow.
And so you have to, I mean, for a man, I think it would be very disconcerting
Yeah.
to sit there and think about God in that situation. They did a great, and they were young men, you know, they were old, 40 to 30 or something.
Yes.
So it's, you never know what you're going to get, especially knocking on doors.
Sure. Any other stories come to mind?
Well, I have an interesting one. It was a couple of years ago. I went to pharmacy and I got into the car, tried to start the car and it didn't work, so I called AAA and this tow truck driver comes and then so he starts to help me and he couldn't, the conversation turned to the gospel, some problem with the way the car was facing, wasn't it? So anyway, he had never heard it and I went over it, he accepted Christ.
Wow.
Then he had to call another tow truck driver. He came and, well, anyway, I discussed the gospel with him and it wasn't the right truck, so he left. Then another truck driver came.
Wow.
3, see, that's why it's called AAA.
Yeah?
And so he was a young man, maybe about 24, and he ended up being able to get the car running while he was doing all this stuff. We were talking about the Lord. He ended up accepting Christ. And actually, it was when he was driving me down to the Mercedes dealer. I was in the car and he told me about his in the truck with him about his terrible upbringing with drugs and his parents. But anyway, he did end up accepting the Lord. And then prior to that, there was a woman who was Catholic and had gone over to India and before I left with the tow truck, we got in a conversation about the Lord, and she was married to a Jewish man, and so we talked about the Jewishness of Christianity, and she took some literature, so that was a good day.
Wow. Yeah.
And anyway, so they towed my car, and I get there, and it was the only problem was a broken ignition. It was simple problem. So by the time I got home, it was like 4:30, but God had done quite a work that
Wow.
that was just dropped in your lap. And
Yeah, so great example of just taking advantage of opportunities. Yeah.
you know, I could do nothing about it, but yet God was the one that worked it for the people, and they were all open and swearing.
Hmm. Well, if nobody has a bad story, I'll give you a bad story.
I wanted to say,
Okay, go ahead.
my friend and I, I always pray before, anywhere, wherever we are, we just pray. And a friend of mine and I were just having lunch after church, and the waitress, and I love people, we always kid and interact, and I asked her, actually it was a gentleman, because one time she asked the lady, and then I asked, we were at the Olive Garden, I guess, and it was a gentleman. And it's really nice when before you pray, and this, I got this from my friend, I didn't never have an original idea, but you ask the waitress or the waiter, we tell them, you know, we're going to be saying prayer right now. Is there anything we can pray for you?
Hmm.
Is there anything that we can, you know, ask the Lord on your behalf? And it's amazing to me how many people say, well, yes. And in this particular case, the woman, I mean, she was crying. She started crying down because she had a number of, you know, she had somebody very close to her family who had cancer and was, you know, was really in dire straits, and just kind of gives you an opportunity to just pray for them. I don't
great.
usually have literature with me. If I do, I forget about it. But a lot of times I'll just keep the program from our church,
Hmm.
you know, that little thing that you get. And then it presents itself. I say, well, you're not worshiping anywhere. I just got, I'd like to invite you to my church. And
Sure.
Amazing that they will take it. And then if they go, if they come, that's between now. It's not my call, whether they
Mm.
come or not. So there's a lot of very simple ways.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm not an evangelist, and a lot of times a little bit shy. But because I like people, sometimes it just opens up.
Sure. And those are perfect examples of, I mean, you sort of went and sought out the person in the bikini, but in these other cases, it was just what was already happening anyways. Unless you were looking for, you weren't looking for.
Well, for someone to come to our church, and
Yeah.
had an address.
Sure. Yeah. So there's great examples. When I was in, I think it was 8th grade, this is one of my first evangelism experiences. Our science teacher was a retired Marine major. I got the best grades in that class because he didn't let me get away with anything. But we had Bible study at lunches. So we go through, a presentation about, just a basic evangelism, learning the appropriate verses. And his thing that he taught us was, well, what you do is to get them involved, first you approach them, and then you have them, read a verse. And then you start interacting with the gospel message. So finally, the day came where we were finished learning the things, and he took me and one other person out to the marketplace and said, okay, Chris, there's a couple of people over there. Go talk to them. So I walked over. I have my little, clipboard with like a survey type thing. And I sat down with them, and they were very friendly. They probably saw this scared little kid coming towards them, so they humored me. But
Well, how did you introduce yourself to them?
well, basically, I said, can I ask you a few questions and share with you something of that sort? It's a long time ago. I don't remember exactly, but what I do remember is that I made him read every single verse on that entire sheet because I was so nervous. I was just thinking, okay, you're supposed to get him to read, and so I just kept making him read over and over again. All I did the whole time was make him read basically my whole thing. So that was when I was very green, but.
What happened?
Well, basically, I did the whole thing, and they read the things, and I said, have a nice day, and they went on with their lunch.
You didn't ask them what did you think of what you read or anything? You didn't go.
No, yeah, it's hard to remember. I mean, that's like it seems so long ago. But I think basically I just sort of, it was a challenge enough, since that was my first time to get that far. So I think I made it through the end of the page, and I said, well, any questions? All right, see you later. So.
What I used to do is the gym. Because I'm a big gym goer, and it's a great playground for evangelism.
Okay, now I want you to think about, we're going to move on in the outline here. And that's a good comment about the gym. As we challenge ourselves to take advantage of these opportunities, you might be thinking, once we start getting into certain tactics, like, oh, I wonder how that would work with this person or in that situation, and start thinking about situations that you wouldn't normally think about that are actually, tow trucks and restaurants and the gym, wherever. Let's see. We are on C, the landscape. Okay. So I want you to consider if you were to pack your backpack to, do a Mount Everest expedition, something of that sort. You need certain things, right? Ice picks and snowshoes or whatever they use. They're not snowshoes, the crampons for the ice climbing. And now imagine you have that same backpack and you're dropped off in the Mojave Desert. Well, that's not going to do you any good, right? Well, there was the same motive in both situations. You need to have gear so you can survive, right? The landscape. But you need the appropriate gear for the appropriate landscape. So we just want to take a moment and pause and think, what is the landscape behind these interactions? What is the spiritual reality and what is the social reality? So we want to ask, how do we move from knowledge that we have to meaningful interaction? So I know some of you have done previous apologetics courses here where you've systematically gone through a lot of different arguments and things like that, or you've done reading yourself, or you're continuing to learn. So how do we move from the things that you've come to learn and that are in your head into meaningfully applying that to those interactions? In other words, a method that will work. So let's survey the terrain. One, let's talk about the spiritual reality. This is the next box there. In Ephesians 6:12, we see that there's a spiritual struggle. This isn't just me and another person having an impasse. There's something happening behind the scenes, right? There's actually a war going on between spiritual forces and principalities that we are sort of drafted into when we get involved in the Great Commission. And also, under letter B there, the good aspect of that is that we're on the right side and we have the divine power to tear down strongholds and anything that's built up against the knowledge of God. So I've summarized it in C there. We operate in an earthly context, but there is an underlying spiritual component. And it's helpful to make that distinction also because when we deal with people, we want to remember that God has a broken heart for people, even though sometimes the enemy works through people against Christianity. Ultimately, we want to redeem the person, but have a war against the powers and principalities of darkness. So we make that distinction, and it softens our heart towards the person, but it also gears us up with that divine power against the spiritual aspect of it. So it's kind of both and at the same time. What about the social reality? At lunch today, I was on Facebook, and I read about 4 or 5 different posts that people had put about things happening in California. There's a gentleman named Robert Lopez from Cal State University Northridge that just resigned his tenure because of all the pressure from progressive peers for him to act and teach a certain way. Or, for instance, we also have this bill right now about basically wanting to make it so that if you're a religious institution like, say, Biola or Westmont, that you don't have access to things like Cal Grants because you're not inclusive of certain things. So there's, and I can mention other things, but it's becoming so blatantly clear, and its culture changing so scarily rapidly.
Well, is it a fact that those institutions would discriminate against someone who really has no faith or of a different faith?
Well,
Would those institutions not accept them?
sure.
That doesn't.
Yeah, well, there's a few distinctions there. One is, Biola, first of all, you have to sign a statement of faith in your application. So that's one barrier. But let's say you took that away and then you admitted people despite that not making an admission of faith or confession of faith. Then the next barrier would be they not only would want you to allow that person in, but they'd want you to, what's the word? Champion or promote their lifestyle and not teach against anything, even though that's against your own religion. So basically, it's a war against Christianity.
The instructor, not the students, because the students would not be teaching that.
No, but you'd have to not only admit those people, but not teach anything against it in your institution.
Right, and I could understand that for an instructor, but as far as a student, they would enroll a student, right? They would give them access to that university.
No, presently at Biola, no. I don't know about Westmont.
Does every student have to sign that statement?
Yes, that's part of the admissions.
I didn't know that.
That's part of your application, yeah.
There's also conduct rules you have to abide by.
That's correct, yeah.
Right, I understand that.
Yeah. So the idea is if they take away the funding, they sort of stunt the school, and people won't consider that an option because they can't get a grant there, a state or a federal grant. So all that to illustrate is that we're very clearly in a post-Christian culture, and you might even say anti-Christian at this point. So it just depends on the situation. I mean, you may meet a tow truck driver who's just, spiritually speaking, ripe for the picking, right? And you may run into another person who's done some reading on the internet and is just geared up against Christianity. So I'm not saying everybody is anti and post-Christian per se, but people are very aware of those trends and sort of, as the sort of silent majority, being swayed that way as the basic culture. Just something to keep in mind about who you might run into. B, belief that God is irrelevant versus lack of exposure. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look at these next two, where it says the angle scale, and then there's another one on the back of somewhere. Where is it? Diagnostic scale. Did you find that one? So this helps illustrate the point that sort of the standard knowledge up to a certain point has been people don't know the gospel. They need to be told the gospel, and then you walk them through understanding it. They see their need, and then they have a conversion, and then they grow in the faith, right? Now, I'm not saying that's not still the case in a lot of cases, but I'm adding this other aspect, right, where culture is changing, and people are being swayed to a point to where they already even know some of the gospel. They know the basic worldview to a degree. And that's not their issue. Their issue isn't ignorance or lack of exposure. It's is it relevant? Do I need God for something? So that's why I say I'm sorry, I'm lost in the shuffle here. Belief in God, that God is irrelevant versus lack of exposure. So if you look at these two scales, the angle scale is sort of the classic way of understanding that, right? Engel wrote this in the late 70s or mid 70s to kind of describe from a behavioral psychology standpoint what somebody goes through when they're evangelized over time as a process, versus this diagnostic scale, which is sort of an adaptation from Greg Gansel. So, I mean, look at these starting points. On the angle scale, the starting point is awareness of a supreme being, but no knowledge of the gospel. But on the diagnostic scale, the starting point is something like suspicion of truth claims. In other words, truth is relative, or there is no truth, or there's no objective truth. That's a whole different starting point, right? One person is just sort of a blank slate, and the other person has already made a decision against a fundamental concept that you need to have the gospel. This is the truth, and I want to offer it to you. Well, if they don't believe there's objective truth, then you've got a lot more in your way than you do on the angle scale. So you can look at those more. Those are interesting. That's the basic idea. And then continuing on social realities, radical individualism. So the idea of, this plays into a lot of the cultural and political things that we're facing right now, such as you'll hear dignity mentioned a lot, right? For instance, here's another little story. At Loyola Marymount, this is a Jesuit Roman Catholic institution. That doesn't necessarily mean they're conservative, but I mean, that's their heritage, right? You would think that, anyways, that'll play into the story. So there's a group of 3 students putting up a transgender celebration sign. Hey, it's a club on campus. I can understand that. They're putting up the thing that they're doing, right? So an office employee of the school, an official office employee, walks by and politely has an interaction with them and isn't mean or anything, but says, well, this is interesting. Basically says, this is interesting. This is a Roman Catholic school, yet this is you're having this celebration, which sort of stands against the traditional view of the Catholic Church. So seemingly things went fine, right? Good interaction, not a big deal. The next day, the students accused this person of a hate crime and reported them to the LAPD and to the leaders of the school, who opened an investigation. And the quote, if you read the news article, is when they were interviewed, like, what's the problem? And they said, we don't mind you having an opinion or a view or a belief unless it denies our very existence, right? So they felt that their dignity was betrayed because their dignity and their identity is totally wrapped up in their sexual identity that they're celebrating.
So I asked when that happened,
This is like a month ago.
because I have two grandnephews and or great-nephew, whatever they are, and the niece is there right now.
Yeah,
Two boys are already graduates, that's why
sure.
their mother at least is a believer.
And I don't want to overgeneralize. I'm just saying this is what happened.
I was shocked when you said that.
Yeah,
They're Catholics.
You know what? I know there are believers in the Roman Catholic Church, but it isn't the same as Christianity.
no, I understand.
But I know their foundation should not
Sure.
support.
It should be somewhat shocking that shift has happened.
It was, that is.
Yeah, well, she became a believer before she married the Catholic, then she converted to
Oh, I
Catholicism.
see.
Go ahead.
Okay, I think we live in a culture, and these are among more adults, our established culture of overreaction.
Mm.
It's not news, it's breaking news. Everything's a big deal. There's this overreaction, and it's become a contagion, and it's permeating itself over into these kinds of situations. People think it's normal. What do they define normal as? What the most people do. That's what I learned in psychology. It's what the majority does. That's what's normal. Okay, and now that's like well, anyway, it's permeating into little everyday matters.
Yeah,
People just overreact and jump to conclusions.
Sure.
And it's a cultural thing, and I don't like it.
Yeah,
I see
I
it
agree.
so clearly.
yeah, and it just makes you wonder. I mean, I always feel like I think I'm a fairly calm, reasonable person. Why can't we just have a calm, reasonable interaction? I mean, the person thought she was having that, and then the next day she gets blasted. I haven't followed up on it yet. I think it's still pending. But I just wanted to get at this underlying thing to remember that, again, there's a lot of people in the middle that just are sort of commonsensical and being blown by the wind towards this. That maybe they're not fully there yet. They can still be reasoned with. But the people, I'm just saying, when you run into people maybe that are more towards that extreme, I'm bringing up dignity because, let's see if I can say this in a breath, but I mean, basically you had the Enlightenment era, that we got this sort of utopian ideal where we thought we didn't need God anymore, and then suddenly we lost all of our transcendent values and objective groundings for things, like meaning and human dignity, things like that. Once you pull the rug out from under all that, over time, up till now, suddenly we're seeing the consequences of that, right? Because people are fishing for a way to have meaning and dignity. And so instead of the classic imago Dei, no matter who you are or what your problems are, you are utterly valuable because you're made in the image of God. Now it's how I feel about my self-identification and my dignity. It's self-made. It's this existentialist holdover thing where you're forming your own meaning and your own dignity relative to your own feelings about it. So in that context, there's a lot of landmines, right? Like this lady ran into. So I just want you to be aware of that sort of individualistic sensibility that you're going to run into, because you may run into a reasonable person, but if you're out there enough and you start talking to people, you're going to run into somebody that that is sort of, the way I say it is they've drunk the Kool-Aid, you know? I mean, they're sort of signed up for that mentality. And it's not always completely rational. A lot of times it's emotional, but that's the tacit rationality behind it. That's how we got there, is that historical movement. And then lastly, D, we're in a pluralistic society. So you'll run into the attitude that, well, that's fine, you know, your Christianity thing's fine or whatever, but I don't need to hear about it. You know, you do that in your own time. I don't want to. Everybody has their own thing. It's relative. All roads lead to God. Those kind of attitudes. These are all just various facets of the society we live in, right? So sort of given that, I mean, we could probably talk all night just about what our society's like right now. But that's sufficient for us to ask, what's our place? What's our role? How do we fulfill the Great Commission given that landscape, that context? Well, let's start with some general ideas of where we should be as Christian ambassadors. A, this is on the next section 3, our role. Letter A there, we should be a diplomat. Okay, so, and this ties back in with what I said about, yes, it's warfare. We don't ever want to forget that. It's very serious business. Yet, it's a person that we want to be gracious with. There's a number of places we can go to see that in Scripture. 1 Peter 3:15, the idea of being ready to give a defense and an answer when people ask you is followed by, yet with gentleness and reverence. That's always part of the equation. It's not like I'm just going to go out and look for somebody to preach at and shout at. I'm told by Scripture, I'm commended by Peter as an apostle to do it with gentleness and reverence. Matthew 10:16, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves, or gentle as doves. That plays it again, right? It's serious business, but our method is to be gentle as doves. Colossians 4, 5, and 6 is very good. Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. So be smart. Make the most of every opportunity, and let your conversation be always full of grace. All right? So basically, be nice. Season with salt so that you may know how to answer everyone. In other words, have a tactic, have a game plan, have a method. Know your content and know how to use it. So be smart, be gracious, and be tactful, or have a tactic. Now, as a diplomat, if you look at that next slide there, how we should interact. This means that we want to control appropriately, and these will play out more as we get into the first tactic, but we want to control appropriately, but not coerce. We want to be assertive, but we don't want to be abrasive or abusive. We want to manage the conversation, but not manipulate the person. Be shrewd rather than rude. That's my favorite one, because it rhymes. We want to be diplomatic, not combative or defensive. And lastly, we want to have an offense, but we're not looking to offend. So that gives you an idea of the biblical ethic of how we should be as diplomats, as ambassadors, when we share with people. Now, let me just give you these metaphors that will help to solidify this picture. We need to be like a Google map. Okay, so you put in your destination. Let's say the destination is HaDavar. And let's say that all 4 of you came from different locations. Well, think of that as a metaphor, right? The destination is a relationship with God and to be right with God. That's where we want to draw everybody if we can through our conversations, our interactions, whatever questions they have. So you may be coming from a Hindu background, and you may be an atheist, and you may just have had a bad experience in a Christian school when you were a kid. Everyone's coming from this slightly different perspective. So as a person, we need to be bringing these people from these various locations, and we need to know the lay of the map so that we can bring them appropriately to the right spot, right? It's not the same directions for everybody's route. So we need to be like a Google map if we want to get people to the destination. We want to be like a gardener. So a gardener, when you interacted with the tow truck drivers, you were harvesting at that point, right? There was a crop and it was ready to be picked, which is a beautiful thing. But we're not always going to be in that situation. Sometimes we're gardening. So, for instance, there was one person, right, that you shared with, but they went off.
The lady who
Okay,
visited India and another.
sure. So think of the parable of the soils, right? And usually we read that, or at least usually I had read that in the past as, well, there's these bad soils, and then there's a variety of bad soils and then the good soil. And evangelism and sharing and reaching people is all about just going out and finding the people that are ready and picking them, like the good crop. Well, if you're in an agrarian society, a farming society, and you hear this parable, your next thought wouldn't be, okay, let's just go pick the crop and forget about the rest of the soils. Your thought is going to be, well, how do I make those ready for a crop, right? So if it has weeds, you need to get the weeds out. If it has rocks, and there's a picture on here of a piled up rock wall. This is what they would do. I'm sure they did this worldwide, but in New England, I'm sure they did it on these older farms. I show up and there's a field full of rocks and I need farmland. Well, I'm going to take all those rocks, and they would use them to make a wall, a barrier. That's where all those rocks came from, was from the field. So, with that metaphor in mind, whatever person you run into, you may be picking weeds or you may be moving rocks. Or God may have brought you somebody that hears the gospel and is ready. So there's sort of this wide scale, kind of like on the diagnostic or the angle scale, either of those. It's good to look at. Think about where's the person you're running into on this scale. If they're at a -9, maybe you're not going to just do a very simple gospel presentation. Maybe you need to talk about other things. Or if they already seem amenable, maybe you're ready to if they're only a -1, then they're ready for the gospel. And lastly, think of yourself as a diagnostician. So if you're a medical professional and somebody comes into you, what are you going to do? You're going to figure out, based on their symptoms, where they're at and what they need, right? You're not just going to give everybody antibiotics, although that's kind of what they do now. So those are just some pictures to help. And let's take a break and get a drink of water, stretch your legs, and then when we come back, we'll start actually talking about a tactic. So let me just, I want to say a few things. One is I want to just mention a little bit about myself, since I didn't take the opportunity to do that, and also just very briefly paraphrase where we've been and where we're headed. So again, I'm Chris Sandoval. I studied at Biola University, undergrad and graduate. Did Masters of Philosophy of Religion and Ethics, which is a mouthful. Which just means after studying, I have even more questions than I started with. That's what happens in philosophy. That's not true. I have good answers. But I was a pastor's kid. I grew up in a Christian home. Sort of the classic story, go off to college, question your beliefs, and look for answers that you never internalized yourself when you were younger. And presently, I am the chapter director of a ministry at UC Irvine, not too far from here. It's a ministry called Ratio Christi, which means Reason of Christ in Latin. And what we do is we sort of are the tool. If all the campus ministries are our tool belts, we're the measuring tape. We sort of take the big, heavy questions and have discussions and we're sort of the people that operate on Mars Hill, as it were, in conjunction with other ministries do discipleship and fellowship and church and all those things, and we champion them as well. But we specifically answer the hard questions and deal with those discussions.
Where do you do this?
Well, we have a weekly meeting. Right now it's bi-weekly because it's summer, but in the fall it'll be weekly. And I work with professors as well to have them involved in different capacities and to help sort of exhort them to impact the campus as well. And we do an annual event every year, at least one big event, usually a couple of. Christian professors, yes. Sometimes we even liaison with others to open up dialogues and things, but yeah, primarily with Christian professors. Because if I want to affect as many people as I can, but if you're a professor and you have 30 people at a time coming through your class, and you have a way of impacting them as they come to you on the side and things like that, then I want to liberate you to make a big impact as well.
Are you seeing much of the anti-Semitic stuff going on?
I see all kinds of things there. They had a Free Palestine display up. Bernie's people were marching the other day. I've seen Southern-style preachers preaching hell and damnation. I've seen everything there so far.
You are not on their staff.
No, I work for a nonprofit ministry organization as a missionary, basically. So instead of going to Africa, I came to Irvine.
It's probably less.
It's got its own set of issues, let me tell you. So that's who I am, and I like to take opportunities to work through this material and teach it when I can. And I just want to paraphrase what I'm saying here, so it's not unclear. I mean, the big picture is we're the church. We're here commissioned by Jesus himself to make disciples. And there are varying degrees of people we're going to run into in all sorts of different spiritual and social states. And just to clarify, those two scales I gave you, one is the Engel scale. That's sort of the traditional, from the 70s, original scale this guy developed, right? So you can find, it's just a scale. It measures where people are at. You can find a Christian on that scale, and you can find somebody who hates Christians on the scale. It's an assessment tool. You go, let me see where this person falls under the descriptions on the scale. And then the diagnostic scale is sort of a modern interpretation of that very same scale. So it's just a way of assessing the person you're talking to and thinking through, how might where they are on the scale change how I interact with this person, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. Which moves us into me presenting this tactical approach, or this tactic, or this game plan, right? Now, I would say this is especially effective when we're running into people that have sincere questions, like obstacles. Like if you run into somebody that says, well, I just don't even believe the supernatural exists, so I don't really want to talk about it. Well, you would need to approach that person at that level, right? You could say all you want from Scripture, but if they don't even believe the supernatural exists, then you're wasting your breath. You can pray for them, and God works in mysterious ways, but on a personal interaction, we're called to give an answer for the hope that we have, and that would be the spot at which you need to interact with that person.
So how would you respond to that person?
Well, I would,
You approached.
yeah. So I would say something like, what I would do is I would think of a concept or a thing that exists that is non-material, and I would start with something like that. Like, are there things that exist that you can't see? So I would do it in question form and sort of tease out their worldview and see how far they've thought about it themselves. Well, it'll come up right now when we talk about this. So the first tactic, and the idea of these tactics is to take any situation and sort of have you be in the driver's seat, right? Like I said before, to control the conversation but not be like coercive. But there's a mission here, and we want to succeed in winning people or moving them towards being one. So these tactics keep you in the driver's seat. The first tactic is called Columbo. Yeah? Are you guys familiar with the show Columbo? You guys watch this? Is everybody familiar with the character? So who is this guy, right? At the end of the day, he always solves the case, but in the meantime, the person he's interacting with is like, who is this guy? He looks like he just woke up. It looks like he hasn't combed his hair. He probably woke up in that jacket, and he's always got the cigar, and he's scratching his head. And he seems to be this like doofus character, right? He's always asking, I just don't get it. I'm just trying to figure this out. And then he's about to walk away, and it's always goes, and the person's finally glad that they got rid of him, and he turns around and he goes, one more thing, let me ask you. Always one more thing, right? So we're sort of borrowing his character as an example of this tactic. So the idea is, rather than coming in, let's say I approach a person, I could come in and I could say, let me tell you all about Christianity. I'm going to give you 5 points. I'm going to give you a positive case why this is true. Well, what I'm doing when I do that is I'm saying, I have something to say, and I want you to think of all the ways you can to try to tear it down. That's essentially what I'm doing in a lot of situations. Now, contrast that with me coming in and saying, that's interesting. I'm just wondering, what do you mean by supernatural? Or, what do you mean by physical? And asking questions of what they're saying by opening a conversation with them. So, for instance, an entry point might be something like somebody's shirt or their tattoo, and you ask them a question about it, right? Or the even asking somebody if you can pray for them at the restaurant. That's an entry point, right? Because it starts a conversation, and they say something like, well, I don't really go to church because for whatever reason. And as you talk to them, it turns out they had some bad experience, right? So it's not really that they have a problem with the Christian beliefs per se. They actually have a problem with an experience they had with people. But the tactic is, the Columbo tactic is to start a conversation. And when they make a statement, you ask something like this, number one, what do you mean by that, right? So somebody may say, well, I believe that morality is relative. Like, let's say they have a coexist bumper sticker on their car or something, and use that as a conversation starter. You might say, well, what does that bumper sticker mean? Or what message are you getting across with that bumper sticker being on your car? Why do you have that on your car? And then they start answering questions, right? So it's the first step to managing the conversation, because you're sort of almost interviewing them, right? You're like the interviewer, and you're steering the conversation almost from the back seat, right? Because you're not over the top and saying, no, I want to preach. I want to tell you the truth. You may be preaching perfect truth, but they're not hearing it because they don't want anything to do with it. But if you're asking them questions about their own view, then it has a number of advantages. Here, look on this next page. Here's some benefits of asking. It starts the conversation well. It shows that you're interested, right? You're not just saying, I want to sell you something. You're actually interested in what they think. It gets you educated, right? So if we want to know where they are on the scale or diagnose where they're at so we know how to approach them in our conversation, we got to get educated on where they're coming from. Not everybody that has a coexist bumper sticker has the same opinion. It makes progress without committing to a view. So like I said, you're not like setting yourself up for criticism by saying, I'm making a statement and I want you to tell me why I'm wrong, basically. It eliminates misrepresentation. So at the point later, when you do have a discussion about a certain thing that they're saying, you're not misrepresenting it by jumping the gun. You've already done the homework and by showing interest in listening to their case. You're actually distinctly talking about what exactly they're saying. It exposes vagueness or confusion in their view. So I can't tell you how many times, this is super important because I would say, I don't know what percentage, maybe 80 or more % of the time, people that say something against Christianity are borrowing a slogan they heard somewhere. They heard it on the internet, they saw it on Facebook, they heard some speaker say it. They don't know the rest of everything that was said. They don't know any of the underlying philosophy of the view. They just know that slogan. And anytime somebody comes up to them and challenges them, they repeat the slogan. Like when it comes to miracles, extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. Like, I memorize that, and now anytime a Christian says anything about Jesus or miracles, I'd throw that out there and they're shut down instantly, right? Well, in this strategy, you're having a conversation where you're asking them questions, you're sort of interviewing them, and they say that, and you say, oh, well, what do you mean by that? And you start to sort of deconstruct the inner workings of their view. So it eliminates them being able to throw out a slogan and get away with it. Let's put it that way. And it puts you in the driver's seat, as we said. So you're sort of steering the conversation. Now, the what questions are sort of getting you educated on what they're saying. And then you can move on to a how question. How did you come to that conclusion? So it's one thing to sort of say, what are the nuts and bolts of your view? What are the various things you believe and how do they go together? But that's just making an assertion. Now you're asking, well, how did you come to the point of thinking that? So like I mentioned, somebody may have had a bad experience when they were younger, and then they latched onto the slogan because it gave them a way to fulfill their sort of emotional angst against Christianity. And whenever they want to avoid Christianity, they use the slogan, but they've never really entertained what it means in depth. So when you ask them, how did you come to that conclusion, you're probably going to end up hearing the story of how somebody hurt them. They don't actually have that view after all, or they don't have any good reason to believe that view. So I've described it as uncovering the logic of their view. So those are two types of questions you're going to ask during conversation, and then ultimately it leads to number 3, leading questions. So again, you're sort of in the driver's seat, even though it seems like you're only asking questions. What you're actually doing is you're fact-finding, you're exposing the view, and once you've done that, then you're taken to the next step, and you're asking questions that cause them from their own mouth to expose the problem with their own view, right? You haven't made any assertions at this point about Christianity or God or anything. They're from their own lips exploding their own view and showing that they need something better. And at some point in the conversation, when you lead them there, then you're in a position where the need is exposed, right? They thought secular humanism was the ticket, but upon further inspection, suddenly there's a vacuum that needs to be filled. Christianity is available. It's coherent. It makes sense of reality. And given the need that they see in the absence of their view making enough sense, suddenly you have an opening, right? But you've done all this preliminary work of having conversations where you're asking questions. All right, I said a lot of words there. Maybe I can take a moment and let you grill me or ask a question to clarify in case I've not clarified that.
I think that's very important. From my work that I do, they explain that they do the talking and you find out exactly what they are. And when I find that when they're asked, if people ask them a question like, "Are you saved?" they'll say yes when they're not. Whereas, when they have to explain.
Mm-hmm. Right, so you might ask, well, what does that mean for you?
Yeah,
and then they start to describe it, and as they're describing it, you're going, they don't understand the gospel at all. And then you start unpacking other things that they're saying. Yeah.
But that's not
Yeah.
necessarily what you're going to be asking a stranger. I mean, that's something that you have, I'm speaking for myself.
Mm-hmm.
That may be something that I already have a relationship with. I have another connection with them.
Sure.
That they can, and we can relate to each
Mm-hmm.
other. You don't just go up to, and right now I'm retired, my realm of influence basically is very limited.
Sure.
You know, people I meet when I take a walk, people when I go somewhere, or I'm on a plane or whatever.
Mm.
And there are a lot of questions such as, you're not gonna just ask a person. Someone
Oh,
you've
you
never.
wouldn't ask, I would never start a conversation like
Right,
I was saying.
Yeah.
And, you know, your role is so different than ours. You're in a professional setting with very learned professional people. The people I interact with are not at that level with their
Sure.
education, with, with their knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of, say, psychology or philosophy. I never
Sure.
studied philosophy.
Uh-huh.
I never, just in school you have maybe
Right.
a couple of classes in psychology, but, I never really pursued anything
Right.
of that nature. So it would be so different from my standpoint, from where I am, level that I'm at.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, go ahead.
Am I explaining that?
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah, I'm not-
I'll let Jeff say what he's going to say.
Yeah, I was just to sort of summarize what you're doing so far.
Sure.
This is an answer to the call that God gives each of us to be salt and light. That we're supposed to give every man an answer whenever those opportunities arise. And it could be in any walk of life. It could be in any situation.
That's right.
So this is one tactic that we can use, and you'll be describing other tactics
Sure.
for the rest of the class that we can use when we come across people in a variety of situations.
Right. And we can call this the queen of all tactics, because this is sort of standard operating procedure. And the beauty is that in any context, you don't have to stress out or be afraid about what you have to say. You're basically exploring the person. And if all you did was get to know a person who isn't a believer a little bit better, and you stop at that point, nothing is lost. Things are gained, right? Because they probably know you're a Christian, and you're creating a positive impact as far as their view of Christians, because you genuinely care, you're genuinely asking. So you're not trying to force the issue. And if I was talking to, if I went to UCI and I talked to one of the secular philosophers, the conversation is going to be different than if a Christian engineer goes and talks to a Christian engineer, or a Christian grandmother goes and talks to a Christian grandfather, or whatever. The where it hits the road, yeah.
That pretty much starts all that dialogue. First of all, the commonality that we have starts it.
Right. Yeah, I think, do you guys know who Ray Comfort is? Have you ever seen his videos? Like, I watch his videos and I go, I'm glad for him, but I could never do that. Like, I could never be that guy. There's some people that just have certain gifts. And there's other people who are completely introverted, who have caught the fire of wanting this to happen, and silently, with nobody seeing, they're having a relationship with a friend or a family member, and they're slowly leading them to Christ, just by caring about them and uncovering what their needs are, and then answering those needs as they are exposed. That's really what we're doing. So it works. I think it works across the board. I'm just illustrating it kind of more heavily towards the, dramatic social context that we find ourselves in, because some of us will find ourselves in that position if we leverage ourselves out there far enough. But that doesn't mean you have to, it doesn't mean you have to show up at the most secular possible campus and go start talking to the strangest looking person you can find. I'm not saying that at all. But if you did, it would work. Tattoos are great conversation starters, by the way. Now, let me just say something. Broadly speaking, this tactic, we call it Columbo because that's a nice reference. It's a good image, right? The kooky detective. But in logic, we would call it something like reductio ad absurdum, which in Latin means reducing to absurdity, right? So basically, you are taking them out of their comfort zone, right? They've found comfort in having this slogan or this view, and you're exposing that it's not sufficient. You're even getting them to walk through by these leading questions. Suddenly, they're finding themselves without answers. That their view doesn't answer these fundamental questions like where is value and meaning and purpose, things like that. Things that they intuitively and as a human have to adhere to, like objective morality. Well, if you're an evolutionary naturalist, that's not available for you. So if you show that impasse for somebody, suddenly there's an opening for Christianity. So you're reducing the view to an inadequacy, to an absurdity. Or, as it says here, is the view acceptable when you take it to its full logical consequence? Like, if what you're saying is true, what else is true, and are you willing to live with that? And if they're not, then suddenly there's an opening for a superior worldview, which is Christianity. And if what we believe is true, it is superior as an explanatory view, right? So, one more page here, number 4, perfecting through practice. So, now again, I think this works whether it's somebody you already know or somebody you may meet on an airplane or wherever. You can start by anticipating, right? So this is probably even easier if you already know somebody, because you've probably already heard a few of their ideas, and you can anticipate how the conversation might run as you ask them questions. And then you have an interaction, and after you have the interaction, you assess it, and you say, "We did that. How did that go?" And then aloud, I just put, I had to have all the same first letters, so I put aloud. But practice aloud. It's kind of like anticipating, but you're practicing after the fact. After you've assessed how it went, you practice aloud what you might say the next time. You're almost role-playing. See what time it is. Oh, it's time, isn't it? Okay, so that's the Columbo tactic, and hopefully you can see that sort of method of, maybe another good way of saying it is almost being an interviewer of people, has a lot of benefits to it, and it's sort of the core tactic. And a lot of the other tactics will just be certain tools to use in certain situations as things come up. So next time, hopefully we can take some time and role play this a little bit. And so I'll see if I can find a trench coat for next time. Maybe not. A trench coat, so I can look like Columbo. If you have a moment and you want to see some of the books up here, we can look at those. And thank you guys for coming tonight, and see you next time.